You find yourself in a dark room, Georgios. You hear slow breathing, like the ominous breathing of a pervo. You turn on the lights, and you see me doing burpees. What do you do?
I shoot it with my bow. That's the standard answer. No, wait. I cast magic missile at the darkness. Oh, wait, the darkness is gone. Oh, crap.
It's gone. I turn the lights on. I'm doing burpees.
That's no. Well, at least you're not a gazebo.
Yeah,
right, that's enough pop references for now.
And I'm fully clothed, so it's not a terrible thing to see me doing burpees fully clothed.
That's at least, your stance on the issue.
Indeed, so that folderall is by way of introduction to our first ever RPG show, Georgios.
Yes. Rocket-propelled grenades.
Indeed. Now, we have an interesting dynamic in this thrust of our milieu, and that is that Georgios is someone who spent many, many years playing role-playing games and no longer does. And he has very wide experience, and he's played a lot of different systems. I played once when I was younger, and then didn't play for years, but I'm currently playing, but I know fewer systems. So these podcasts will be very much Georgios schooling me on my spurious opinions, which is very different to every other show we do.
That is correct. You thought we'd shake up the dynamic a bit.
Indeed. So I want to start, Georgios, by just asking a very open question.
Mm-hmm.
Why RPGs? What do they... So this is a podcast directed at board gamey people about RPGs. Now, some of our listeners will be RPG players concurrently, but
the term
also
you're
one
looking
of our
for
listeners...
is omni-nerds.
Indeed. One of our listeners, I know for a fact, wrote an email saying, "You're doing RPGs. Why would I want to listen to that?" So some of the listeners aren't going to know. So why RPGs? What do they offer that's different to board games? What makes them unique and rewarding?
That's when you say open question, you really mean, ramble for 20 minutes and I'll cut in when I'm bored, right?
That's what I mean.
Oh, yeah. They're games wherein you talk a lot and you do things, and they have a lot of influences from all over the spectrum. And I don't know, I think one of the most interesting differences to board games is that role-playing games generally, at least thanks to the last 20 years, if not more, have a far broader emotional spectrum than board games do. Board games are reasonably narrow in the kind of emotions you experience and the kind of emotional state you find yourself in. Role-playing games, on the other hand, because they are so story-dependent, and a lot of games openly attempt to sort of dive into certain genres of stories, look to provide you with a far broader emotional experience. They have a far wider palette of emotional reactions that they can evoke from you.
Yeah, I think I find board games scratch an itch for me because I'm a wildly unsuccessful actor. I don't spend a lot of my time performing, right? And board games, role-playing games are very much that. They're much more of a performative form. Mm-hmm. Even the more rigid ones, even the ones that are predicated around combat like D&D, they have such a strong element of performance, they have such a strong element of investment.
Mm-hmm.
And they offer something that is that's different, that is almost the game. When it's perfect, the game melts away, right? And you just do this thing that facilitates a story, and it doesn't almost feel like a game, it feels like a sort of communal creation. That's the ideal, right?
Yes, I think, and I'm sure it's going to be a topic that I will return to later, if not this episode, then in a later episode. You're describing, as far as I can tell, you're describing an approach to role-playing games that is quite common and has to do with ideas of immersion, has to do with emotional identification of the character you're playing, and has to do with experiencing the story, experiencing the atmosphere of the story you're creating, in a way that's probably that people have tried to describe for years, and they bounce back and forth from one term to another. But one term I've heard a while back was they describe it as a state of flow, or if you which I believe is a term from psychology. Then there's this idea of immersion, which is has probably its roots in film theory, and all these kind of ways in which people try to describe this state of really, really experiencing the game, or as you say, the game sort of melts away, and you're just in the moment. And that's definitely a strong strand of what role-playing games do and what attracts people to them. And yeah, I think interesting enough, there are quite a few other approaches to role-playing games that kind of work together, don't work together. Now we're moving into the kind of pointing at the theory wars of the 90s. But that's what you described is definitely a strong part of what appeals about role-playing games and what makes them so interesting as a pastime.
If I were to make the statement RPGs are less mechanically rigorous than board games, is that a true statement, or is that a load of old guff?
I think the key to role-playing games and the rigidity of the rules lies in lies in something that I think Dave Arneson sort of realized. It's the fact that because everything you're talking about is sort of actualized verbally, it exists only because it's spoken. You can change it in any way you want. You can reframe it. You can approach it from a different angle. Just by talking about things differently, you can change the situation in such a way that you find a new out from the pickle you find yourself in. So, for example, if now we're going to these generic RPG scenarios, you find yourself trapped in a dungeon and you're low on food, what have you, and as you try to find an exit, you stumble upon a group of, let's call them orcs. Traditionally, or rather the immediate response would be, okay, this is obviously some kind of conflict. We're trying to sort of, I need a way to beat these orcs, set up traps, what have you. But in theory, since you can, in a role-playing game, you can sort of suggest all kinds of ways in which you can sort of manipulate the situation. You can just go, I'll try to talk to these orcs. I'll try to use my charm, my skills of diplomacy, my knowledge of legends and orc legends or lore, to befriend them. This ability to sort of leave the path that sort of suggests itself to you and just go somewhere else means that these games seem less rigid. They seem open. They seem like everything is possible. They seem like everything is fluid. Everything can change. And a lot of the tension in a role-playing game, and a lot of tension, interestingly enough, when people talk about role-playing games, comes from this observation, this idea that everything's possible, or it's clearly rigidly defined, or somebody defines it and stuff like that. So what I'm trying to say with a long-winded analog, is that I wouldn't call them so much as less rigid, but more strongly interactive. They don't prescribe the ways in which you can interact with the game, but they allow you to come up with new ways to interact with the situation.
I mean, I find role-playing games are much more the sort of atheist as opposed to the creationist of board games. Now, let me expand on this analogy. So board games kind of have an irreducible complexity thing, right? Whereas they have a series of mechanisms that fit together. And if you choose to ignore one of those mechanisms, the likelihood is the experience of the game will suffer, if not entirely break down, okay? And that's a sort of irreducible complexity thing. You get this thing that just works the way it is, and you just can't take parts of it out. Whereas, so D&D expresses this explicitly in the rulebook of 5th edition. I don't know about previous editions, but in 5th edition, it says if you don't know a rule, you can't remember a rule, or the rule is not facilitating good play, dispense with it. And D&D offers, I can talk about D&D here, it offers that sort of thing of you can fudge it and the game will still hold its integrity, which I think is very different to board games. I think that's certainly one way that they differ, right?
I don't think I would agree. No, I think the difference is that the things that are obviously rules and mechanics in role-playing games and in board games are not identical. I think there is an irreducible complexity to role-playing games as well, and is heavily encoded in the GM role. It's heavily encoded in the responsibilities and the things they are allowed to do as part of the game that you cannot take away without really making these games very, very challenging to play. And the same is true for, as you said, for board games. I think the rules that you can fudge in role-playing games are minutiae, like is an attack is a attack with a rapier +2 on my dice roll or +4? Does it take another roll to sort of draw the sword, or can I just announce that I'm drawing it? These kind of rules, yes, you can fudge, but much in the same way that you could kind of fudge some rules in board games as well. Like if you're not quite sure whether a certain good at the end of the game is worth 1 victory point or 2, you can just agree to say, right, we're playing now that wheat scores us 1 victory point at the end of the game, and after the game is over, we'll see if we were right or if we misremembered the rule. I think there's a little bit of leeway in board games as well. It's just that role-playing games have this front-loaded minutia rules that those you can fudge as you like. Yeah. If you take
the central core of D&D, roll the d20, add your score to it. Okay.
Not okay. Yeah. Go on. Yeah. Go on.
I mean, it tell me that that's not the core rule to D&D, but I'm pretty sure it is.
No,
I mean, basically everything's predicated on rolling that d20 and adding. You can shake your head, but it is. I mean, you roll the d20, you add your bonuses to it, and that determines whether you succeed or fail. That's in combat, that's out of combat, that's whether you're doing perception, whether you're swinging a sword. It's the central mechanism. Now, we'll come back to whether you think it is or not. I don't see how you can gainsay that, but I'm sure you have a good reason. But, for instance, you can choose, not always, but certainly in certain situations, to just dispense with that core of D&D. And so you don't need to roll here, or you don't roll in this way, or you only roll for damage, or, and still the game will persist. You can't say in Dominion, you draw 3 cards, or you don't buy any cards from the market this turn, and have the game still function in any way that's still recognisably Dominion or enjoyable, right? I mean, I think that's not wrong, is it, what I've just said?
No. I think the only point we disagree is that, again, the core game of D&D, of any role-playing game that's based on D&D, which is, to be fair, almost all of them, is that the GM controls the world and the players control the characters. And that means that the GM basically tells you what to roll and whether you succeed or not. The GM tells you what the effects of that successful or unsuccessful roll are. And if you start removing those bits of role-playing games, that's where it becomes difficult to still get a handle on, which is not to say that the games that do that sort of play around with this core gameplay component of role-playing games don't work. I mean, they do work. There's some very great GM-less games out there. There's some very interesting games that sort of move around narrative control. They all work very well, but they're very difficult to get to if you know role-playing games primarily as variants of D&D. To go back to your comparison to Dominion, this is what you're changing. I agree with you. If you were to change a rule like when we played Dominion this time, your coins don't buy anything. that the game doesn't work, obviously. But the equivalent to that rule is not you roll 2d10 instead of 1d20. The equivalent to that rule in D&D would be your players do not get to narrate directions of the characters. That's the fundamental rule. I think that you're changing that. So I think the what's the word? What's the word you use? The irreducible complexity in board games is much more apparent than it is in role-playing games. Because, like I said, in role-playing, it's buried under tomes and tomes of lists and values and sort of weird ways to put numbers together and subtract numbers from one another to get to another number, which is then you're supposed to feed to your GM so they can tell you what happened.
Whether you succeeded, yeah.
Yeah. So, I think there's a fundamental shift in what the game is and what's facilitating the game in board games and in role-playing games.
And so my question is then, do the mechanics matter? So you
oh my god, this is the 90s all over again.
You clearly know much more about this than me, and I've got my experience is very narrow when it comes to playing RPGs, and you've played a lot of RPGs. But one thing I've noticed is when I've played different systems, what I've found is that fundamentally the systems are trying to facilitate the same thing. And the reason I'm drawn to D&D and the reason I was drawn to Call of Cthulhu is that the mechanics do not get in the way of what is the fundamentally important thing, which is telling the story. So my question is, do the mechanics matter in RPGs?
I'm sorry, this is very funny to me, and I'm not trying to be mean or anything, but I think it's a fundamental question that everybody who plays, enjoys, or loves RPGs will sort of stumble over at some point. Does the system that I'm using actually matter to the experience? Does it change anything? Is it just, interchangeable scaffolding and the core exists outside of the system that I'm using? And
because for me, what I want is the system to be as unobtrusive as possible. I want there to be a feeling that you're playing a game. I don't want it to be an open impro. I want there to be a feeling that there is some element of chance, element of inescapability that rolling dice and adding numbers to them provides that changes it. This is why this isn't an improvisation course. This is a game. It's something different. But for me, I want those rules to be as unobtrusive as possible.
Oh yeah.
I don't want it to be basically an exercise in mental arithmetic, which I've played certain games and that's what they seem to be. Very fiddly, very granular, fundamentally uninteresting because you can't tell the story because you're adding up totals all the time.
Yes. I see where you're coming from, but you have to keep in mind that there's many approaches to role-playing games. There's many ways to enjoy role-playing games as they're gamers, basically. And it's always this mixture of how much solid footing do I want by way of rules and mechanics, and how much do I want the freedom to imagine, the freedom to narrate, the freedom to explore any idea that feels like this is true to what is happening right now. Or maybe I don't care about the truth of the moment. Maybe I care about winning. Maybe I care about experiencing what's happening, like having these beautifully told stories that we tell each other. That's just, again, for those listeners who do remember the Theory Wars, you probably know what I'm talking about. But as many gamers as there are that sort of have different preferences as to how a great game should be put together, how much rules and how much freedom. The same is also true for groups, because these groups have to work together as well, and they need to find a nice balance between solid rules and freedom of improvisation, because those elements do make up a lot of what is appealing about role-playing games. I think the system you use, the rules you use, and those are not necessarily the same thing, matters to a certain degree, and then you hand this over to the dynamics of the people you're playing with, and somewhere between this interplay of what the rules tell you to do, what the system sort of that you agreed to use does, and what you as a group decide to do with that system. Somewhere in this interplay, you find the right spot for your group. Somewhere in there, you find something that works. And I'm not particularly convinced of this idea that a system that doesn't exist or something that's gone, like you said, you don't want this to be pure improv. You want this to still feel like a game, still have structure. To me, that seems to suggest that system does matter. It's just not, the numbers that matter. It's maybe something else about the system that plays into it.
Whereas I really, in board games, I love the intricacies of the system. Mm-hmm. I love the interplay of mechanics. I'm a Eurogamer, essentially, and I enjoy actively the mental arithmetic. I enjoy the manipulation of those things. In role-playing games, I don't want to do that because the story component is so vital that if you spend all your time with your nose in the rulebook or adding up dice rolls and this sort of stuff, fundamentally, you're going to lose any momentum, and that's why I want my rules system to be as unobtrusive as possible. So, going on then, what do you think board gamers listening to this need to know about RPGs to understand what we're talking about?
They need to know, well, ideally they should have played one RPG in their life. Not a computer role-playing game, not a JRPG, not whatever else variation there is of role-playing games. They need to have played some variant of D&D, and by variant of D&D I don't mean AD&D and OD&D or D&D 3.5 or even Pathfinder. If people remember my Gloomhaven treatise, my argument is that most role-playing games are variants of D&D because of how they split up roles at the table and how they sort of put objectives in front of players. Yeah, so they're like my first role-playing game, Shadowrun, is obviously a variant of D&D in the sense that it has a very clear mission structure. You are a group of criminals and you're giving a job to do, and that job usually involves sneaking into some office building, stealing stuff, and then running away again, and for the most part everything blows up halfway between and somebody probably dies, which is really fundamentally not that different from a generic, stereotypical, not particularly innovative Dungeons and Dragons adventure. You have a dungeon or you have a mission you're supposed to solve, some sort of quest, and you go there and you have a plan how to approach it, and then you have contact with the enemy and things happen, somebody might die, and then whoever survives goes back. And based on this very, very basic structure, you can build a lot of very interesting interactions, very interesting, fun dynamics. You can have all these, you can in theory, or in practice in some cases, build these giant epics between these characters and how they change and develop, while fighting orcs and goblins and what have you in between. Or you can have these great ways in which these characters change and grow over time, become more powerful, move into positions where they can change the world in a much more fundamental way than just running into a dungeon and emptying it of all its loot. There are other role-playing games that sort of take this basic idea, having this basic overarching structure, and sending characters in and seeing how they change and develop and usually risk their lives for no apparent reason and die. And I think what people need to understand is this weird balance, this not even balance, this weird mixture of, as you said, improvisation and rigid rules. This weird back and forth between we do whatever comes to mind and we do what gets us ahead in this mission or in this quest. And just to understand the interpersonal dynamics, I think this is really the key to understanding role-playing games, just how much of it is interpersonal dynamics and the things we say and how we say them and what we want to achieve with them.
Well, I think it's very interesting. Role-playing games play this sort of function in a way that board games don't. So you need to be completely engaged not only with the game but the people around you in a role-playing game, and kind of at all times. Whereas, the beauty, and a lot of people write about this, if you've had a shitty day, if you don't feel good, if you're not feeling particularly conversational, if you're shy, if you don't speak the language of the place you're in particularly well, the great thing about a board game is you can focus on the game. You can take yourself out of the need to talk and engage with people in the way you would just in a normal conversation at a table. And RPGs are much more about the people focusing on each other and focusing on reactions to each other, and hopefully, if it's good, not throwing spanners into works. And in a perfect world, basically, essentially, you are the perfect team that work together in the perfect way, and you're able to resolve your conflicts efficiently and fairly. And so it takes a lot more sort of emotional strength, emotional ability, for want of a better word, than playing a board game, I think.
I can't really speak too much to that, but I will note the following. That I don't know if, other people probably have written about this or spoken about this to great length, but one thing I noticed when I moved to Edinburgh for a year, and there I played one of the most influential role-playing campaigns I've ever played in, and at least for my personal understanding of role-playing games and what they can do, is that there seems to be a fairly fundamental difference in style, in how people comprehend and cultivate role-playing in different countries. Because I've read a lot of commentary about role-playing games in the US. I have played role-playing games in the UK. I have played role-playing games in Germany. And it's fascinating to me just how different they are, how fundamentally different they seem to function as this catalyst of social interaction, and how people approach them differently, how people take different roles in them, how people seek different sorts of enjoyment in them, and how different aspects of the game register as being part of the game or not part of the game. I think that's very interesting. So, for example,
so give us some concrete examples. Then, yeah. If there's differences, what differences are they? What are they? What actually are?
Let me just. I don't want to generalize because that's always dangerous, but to some extent, maybe I am. I'm just talking about my own experience.
It's accepted.
Now.
It doesn't need to be. Yeah, it doesn't need to be. You're not the world authority, but you've.
I thought that's the whole point of the show.
You've witnessed things and you've come to your own conclusions. It's clear that it's your opinion. You don't need to preface that. It's just what conclusions have you drawn?
It seems to me that
people can tell you if it's bullshit at a later date.
I'm sure they will. Because not all my observations lead to particularly nice places. But one thing that I've seen with a lot of German role players, with a lot of German groups. And I could probably trace it back to certain influential rules texts, and others have tried to do that, is a certain passivity. Is that even a word?
Yeah.
With the players, that there's a very, very heavy heavy storytelling lifting being done on the GM side, and a fairly low involvement on the player side, in the sense that all the things you just described about being emotionally open, active, reacting to other players, it's still there to some extent, but it's not particularly in the foreground. It's something that happens by the by. What basically happens is it's a story hour for the GM. The GM tells a lot of stories, and occasionally players get to interject a bit or play their little parts in it. But there's a very clear difference of narrative authority, of one person who decides and makes decisions, even about the characters if they don't fit. And that authority sits solely with the GM. I think this is an appealing way of playing role-playing games because that way of playing role-playing games demands so very little investment by the players. It's the easiest way to sort of have a role-playing experience without actually doing much for it. You just sit there and let somebody else tell you a story.
The strong demarcation of roles is also beneficial. Yes. All people know what they're doing when they're doing it, and this seems very limited to me. This is not the way I would like to play, but I see the appeal in it. This guy does this, and I am responsible for this, and I have my little niche within this game, and the GM is going to basically curate a story for me, and I'm not going to contribute to the telling of that story not in an active creating the story way. I am just going to facilitate the story getting from A to Z.
Yeah, pretty much. I'm sort of again, I want to be clear that this, I don't want there to be any judgment in my description of these things. I don't want it to come across as me looking down on these kind of players. The fact that I enjoy this slightly less than other types of role-playing games, I don't think is, or other ways of playing role-playing games is immaterial. It's just, it's a way of playing that I've experienced in conventions myself, where I've run a game and I was met with a lot of wide open eyes and sort of a very respectful silences, and just respectful taking themselves sort of out of the equation and giving me the reins. And a lot of times I didn't know what to do with that, because I just wasn't primed to just tell my story alone, because why would I need players for that? But that was sort of one style of role-playing games. The GM tells a story, and occasionally other people can sort of add in a little color. In the UK, for example, I've seen, or personally I've experienced, a stronger emphasis on and this I think has partly to do with the particular role-playing group I've played, with a stronger sense of soap opera, stronger sense of the emotional lives of the characters and how they interact, and how they not just how they feel about things, but that's sort of the inner angst, the turmoil, the pressure, whatever you want to call it. The emotional conflict is sort of turned outward, is articulated, verbalized, or very consciously sort of influences the actions of the characters, and we wind up these characters who all have their issues, and then we just let them just go at each other and see what happens. Now, that game I've played was a Buffy the Vampire Slayer campaign, which is great fun, but that had a very strong element of that. We all enjoyed the angstiness, if you want to call it that. We all enjoyed the emotional vulnerability of these characters, the fact that we sort of would send them into relationships with each other, even though they didn't really have the vocabulary back then, but I have the vocabulary now, where they weren't emotionally ready, they weren't mature enough, they weren't able to take on the responsibilities to be in a functioning relationship with each other. They were just teenagers, basically, and they couldn't handle things, and that was great fun to us. This sort of, much like you would have in a high drama series, living through these emotions vicariously, these high drama situations, was a huge source of enjoyment for us, and it was something that I really struggled to sort of recreate here in Germany, because it's not particularly easy to find these kinds of players, and I couldn't really. And on the other hand, there's so many other factors that come in, that sort of what it means to play a character like that, sort of emotionally invest in a character like that. I am assuming your experience as an actor sort of might probably mirror that you need to feel a certain safety to really just let all these emotions out, even though they're more or less in air quotes fake. They're still real in the moment, and there's nothing worse than having this real moment be brutally undercut by a really dumb fart joke.
Well, the thing is, it's one of those things, isn't it? My current sort of RPG renaissance, playing D&D, having a couple of D&D groups and regularly playing it, I'm always the DM. Mm-hmm. So and the thing is, because I'm from an acting background, because I've done improvisation, my job always is very much to facilitate the characters playing their story rather than dictate to them what's going to happen. I speak as little as possible. That's my goal.
Yeah, our GM did the same thing,
Yeah, whereas when I was sort of 17, 18 and I was playing games, I was a character, and I don't know whether it's just something that's part of my personality, but I felt an incredible loyalty and affection for the person I was playing. I never quite, when I read about RPGs and I see people talk about, oh, you know, we just dispense with our characters and they die and we roll up a new one. I never quite understood that.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
I become very attached to this person that I'm playing, and their fulfillment and their betterment is my goal. It's a goal within the greater world of trying to solve the problem, find the quest, this sort of thing. And so I've always been very much a player that focuses on being the character and being consistent with the character.
Yeah, consistency is a very good point. Yeah,
and making the game seem like a consistent narrative with real people, rather than just a demonstration of mechanics. I've never understood that, and so recently I started a D&D group, and it sort of fizzled out after a couple of sessions, partly because two of the players became very, very fixated on mechanical optimization with regards to fighting. And that's not the way I DM. And, you know, long threads of talking about syncing this spell with this spell and da-da-da-da-da. And I kind of lost interest because I don't care about that. I don't care about the rules, and I'm willing to fudge the rules to facilitate the story I want to tell. And I want these people to become invested in their characters. I want their characters to grow, and I want their characters to attain three-dimensionality. And so I'm willing to disregard, and if I've got someone at the table telling me I've misinterpreted a rule, that is going to not contribute to that, and that's not the kind of people I play with. And it's no problem if you want to be very mechanics focused, if you want to leverage those sorts of things, that's cool too, just not with me. So tell us, Georgios, what were some of the formative games that you mentioned? Buffy the Vampire Slayer, some other things that formed your sort of canon and your personality as an RPGer.
Actually, yeah, that's a little bit of actual prep I did. So let me start sort of more or less chronologically. Like I said, I started off with Shadowrun. I came in from the Shadowrun video game, and I literally it was during some class. The people behind me were talking about Shadowrun as well, and I perked up because I was reading the review of the Shadowrun video game, and we got into talking, and they explained to me that it was a role-playing game, and so that's the way how I started playing Shadowrun. And what that sort of shaped in me was this, even though, again, hindsight helps you articulate these things, the structure of the role-playing game, the structure of the quest, this mission-based concept of Shadowrun, that sort of convinced me that these are games. Like you said, they have a beginning, they have an end, they have a goal, some sort of goal. In Shadowrun's case, it's survive and finish the mission, and so that sort of opened up the game element. And then a few years later, I stumbled over Star Trek: The Next Generation by Last Unicorn Games, now quite certain defunct. That sort of shaped me in the sense that that was the first time that I found a role-playing setting that I wanted to be in. All other role-playing settings I had no connection to, like any random fantasy setting doesn't mean anything to me. But I had fond memories of watching The Next Generation, and I really liked that sort of this optimistic future, and imagining myself in that setting was something I was looking forward to. Sort of being part of this world, this part of this cosmos, whatever. So that escapism element sort of drew me to this kind of game. And then, of course, as I said, the Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which sort of opened up the emotional palette that you can experience with the characters. And I think the last big push I would mention, even though I'm a bunch of others, is interestingly enough the Paranoia role-playing game, which made me understand D&D fully. Because Paranoia...
Elaborate.
Yes, but Paranoia, if you're not familiar with it, is a dystopian future comedy game.
Very funny, a lot of good fun.
Yes.
I've not played the new version. It was the last version that I played, but you know, and this is a game that actually facilitates the killing of your characters and actively encourages it. But as long as you're into the milieu, that's fine. Your characters can die. And basically, just for those who don't know, you have, is it 7 clones? 8
6
clones? And 6 clones. And then you, basically the whole process of the game is to find hilariously macabre ways to have your clones slaughtered, basically.
Maybe, yeah. We could probably dedicate an entire episode to Paranoia, but well, get back to my point. I think Paranoia, among many other things, was also a satire of role-playing games, specifically D&D, and all the ways in which D&D doesn't work, and all the ways in which D&D only works because the groups, players, GMs are willing to overlook certain fundamental issues with it, or just, don't care about those issues. And Paranoia satirizes those. Paranoia sort of takes this GM character, this omnipotent character, and then says, all right, we have the computer, controls everything, knows everything, but he is crazy and probably evil, and most likely absolutely not interested in your survival. Which is, of course, an obvious inversion of what the DM is supposed to be, or rather a sort of a caricature of what a bad GM is like.
Yeah.
And the entire idea being that you have this one player at the table who has endless power over the fate of your characters, over the fate of what you can or cannot do in the game. Because again, in Paranoia, it explicitly says that one of the key elements, one of the key jokes is that you shouldn't argue with the GM because they can come up with any kind of punishment they want for your character. And I've heard...
What's really interesting is that players don't realise. I mean, I don't know... I haven't read the core books, I haven't read the rule books, because I didn't GM my play of Paranoia. Mm-hmm. But also, the rules are not explained to you. And so you don't know how tests are resolved. And so I found myself trying to work out how tests were resolved, and then going, I think I've got this, and trying to game the system, and the GM punishing me for gaming the system. I mean, it's really mean. But because the game is focused around that, the meanness is funny and not jarring and annoying.
Yes, and if you do it right, it is. You're right. I think the variant of not explaining the rules, I think, is just one way in which you can run Paranoia. Because again, the key element is that you have one player who's omnipotent, who's immensely powerful, and that extends. It's not just part of the world; it extends over the game itself. They can decide what you roll and what you add to it. And one of the key concepts of Paranoia and prior editions has always been make something up. Whatever it is, just make something up. You're the GM, you can do whatever you want. I think where a lot of Paranoia games and groups fail is understanding what the original mindset behind this make something up, or what the original mindset behind, kill the characters is supposed to be. It's all about undermining expectations, all about keeping people unsure of their footing within the game, basically making them paranoid, hence the name of the game, about their characters and about each other. And that, I can speak from experience, has led to some of the most hilarious games I've ever run. Just having players not know what is up or down, not know who's passing notes to whom, what's written on them, how does it affect me, why is my character suddenly dead, and why is everyone laughing? And this kind of experience, this kind of this ignorance of the surroundings in this role-playing game and being at the whim of fate and of a crazy computer and a maybe or maybe not malevolent GM, that can be very funny if you're willing to laugh at the situation and at yourself. But what I'm trying to go back to D&D, I think this basically, by making fun of D&D, I finally understood why D&D worked as well as it did and where it doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, paranoia is self-reflective. It's a comment on RPGs as much as it's a game, although it does function as a game.
Oh yeah, but I think that's the key insight about paranoia. It's still a game. You must play it as a game. The moment you treat paranoia as not a role-playing game, just as an exercise to kill characters, and it so very, very quickly deflates. The straighter you play, and that's a loaded phrase in paranoia parlance, but the more you treat it like a role-playing game, the more you treat it literally like D&D, the GM can really start messing with you, and that's when paranoia shines.
Yeah, and so I had one formative RPG experience when I was 17, and this game not only formed sort of my attitude towards RPGs and the way I subsequently GM'd them sort of 20 years later, but also led me on a path of sort of literary discovery and made me adore nihilism. And that was... And so the game I played was Call of Cthulhu, and it was run by a friend of mine who was just brilliant. He embodied every character he played. He parceled out the information just enough to keep you absolutely tantalized. And the thing, if you don't know, Call of Cthulhu is based in the 1920s H.P. Lovecraft world, and essentially you're a gumshoe detective in most cases. I mean, maybe not a private dick, but certainly a guy working in a university who finds a cryptic verse in a book, or someone's gone missing and you've been contracted to sort of find them out. And inevitably what happens in all Call of Cthulhu scenarios is that you peel away the sort of seemingly innocent events and reveal the tentacled horror underneath. And when done well, Call of Cthulhu is utterly immersive, engaging, and wonderful. And and what's so beautiful is there's not this sense of strength. You're not a superhero. You're a normal human being fighting against things that are undefeatable. And your job is damage limitation, because you don't want to come into contact with these malevolent forces, because they will consume you the minute you do. And so it builds this wonderful, paranoid, deeply, deeply sincere story when it's done well. And as opposed to D&D, which can be played as a combat generator, Call of Cthulhu is much more of a mood establisher. And it led me into a real love affair with Lovecraft's writing and a real respect for Lovecraft's unremitting bleakness that is not an attitude I share, but I think Lovecraft formulates and demonstrates his worldview so beautifully. And it's playing Call of Cthulhu at 17, a bit stoned, with some friends and a guy who was really good, has given me years of absolute joy reading Lovecraft, entering those cyclopean, bleak worlds. And this is why I want to interview Sandy Peterson at Essen, just because those couple of sessions I played when I was 17 really genuinely contributed to my life in a valuable way. And I guess a lot of people find that with RPGs. I guess that's why people have a kind of almost semi-religious devotion to them, right?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I think As I said in the beginning of the episode, I think the emotional bandwidth of what a role-playing game offers as you interact with other people just, reaches, makes you bond with them in a way that a lot of board games can't quite measure up to. Having sort of experiencing like this existential dread and horror, or just, this elation of really, really struggling for a long time and then succeeding in something, or just, having your characters fall madly in love and out of love with each other. All these sort of emotions you can sort of, dive into as an amateur semi-actor, if you want to call it that. It just, it makes people connect with one another. It makes sort of it sort of ties them together. They share an experience. They have emotions attached to that experience. They remember that experience, and they remember the people involved and responsible for it. So I'm not surprised that a lot of role players love going back to that well, love to experience this depth of emotion as they play. And I can see why. I can see why people would buy so many books in the hopes of one day turning this book into this great experience that they sort of have sort of percolating in their brain somewhere.
So I got one last question before we wrap up.
Yes.
So I've been to your house, and you have a whole bookshelf full of RPGs.
Well, one row, to be fair. I have regular books as well, but just one row of the shelf, yes.
And you got a lot of RPG systems, and you were a serious RPGer at one point.
Well, I don't know about serious. No, I wouldn't call it serious, but I did enjoy playing it, and I tried to have regular gaming groups, yes.
Yeah, because I would consider myself a serious board gamer, and it seems that attitude that you now have for board games was with role-playing games at some point, right?
Oh, yes, no doubt. Yeah.
So why did you stop?
I think it's the reason why most people stop. It's a combination of people to play with and time to play in. Like I said earlier, I think I was looking for a group with which I could sort of have these great soap opera style role-playing games where I could have characters fall in love with one another, where I can have them fight one another, like emotionally, like have them have feuds or just rivalries, anything. And it was difficult to establish a kind of appreciation for that kind of game, to sort of create an atmosphere where this kind of gaming could take place and have people buy in to this kind of experience, because most of them had a different background in role-playing games from me in some cases. So that contributed to it. So it sort of slowly wore away my enthusiasm. And then basically time. I think that's most common. It's common for most people, I think, that it's sorry. And it's something I alluded to in the Gloomhaven piece as well, that these games are because the structure of a role-playing game doesn't look at a definite end, doesn't have a clear way doesn't tell you when the game is over, and it doesn't tell you how to sort of time those steps to get there. It's not like a board game where you have 8 rounds, and after 8 rounds the game is over, and you have a very good idea how long the game is going to take. With role-playing games, you basically play until you're done playing, until you run out of steam or you need to go home, because these games rarely provide a clear cutoff point, which means
I think the fundamental issue with role-playing games, right, is something that the board games don't have, except Gloomhaven has it, kind of Pandemic Legacy has it, in that, and so definitely things like Descent and Imperial Assault also have it, is that you need to convene the same group of people, and it's only through the same group of people simultaneously experiencing what you're having that you get the depth and enjoyment. You can't swap new people in and out. And as people get older, the life takes over, And unless you're really devoted to carving out that time, or you lead the kind of life where you don't have adult considerations to think about, you will inevitably fall out of something that requires such discipline and devotion as role-playing games do, right?
Yeah, I think to some extent that's true. I think ultimately it's the definitely there's the fact that you need to do it over and over again, and then one of the reasons why it's so hard to get people to commit is that, at least in my experience, when they hear role-playing games, what they hear is 6-7 hours of my time, and at a certain point in your life, 6 and 7 hours of your time is just not something you can devote to a game. And I mean,
so do you miss it?
I'm not sure. Yes, I mean, generally, yes. I would love to go back and experience something similar to what my best memories of role-playing games are. Something like these great moments where, I mean, what was it? Well, the first time when I was playing a Star Trek role-playing game, where the captain unexpectedly died, and I, as the first officer, now had the responsibility of the entire ship and the crew, and a huge diplomatic crisis on my hands, and I was absolutely unprepared, and the rush and the fear and the tension was just amazing. Or these moments when characters declared the love for each other before they were sort of torn away from each other for forever. These are great memories. These are great moments I've had, and I would love for the chance to return to these kind of moments, to have them, to recreate comparable moments at the game table with a great gaming group. But the effort it takes to sort of create that, the effort, the time it takes to sort of cultivate that, to sort of do the legwork to reach the point where you can do that, I'm not confident enough that I would get enough return on my investment to return to role-playing games. So I'm, as much as I enjoy them, as much as I like thinking about them, talking about them, I'm just not, confident enough that it's worth pursuing again.
So just to finish up, just going to briefly discuss what's going to happen with this show in the future.
Gotta get cancelled.
Oh my god, we're going to get cancelled?
Yes. I didn't even know we were in syndication, but yeah, apparently we're going to get cancelled. NBC just called me.
But
we get one season.
I assume you'll be passing along my share of all the bodacious NBC money.
Well, are you breaking up? You're breaking up. I can't hear you.
Yeah. So yeah, basically what we want to do is we want to have certain different shows about certain different aspects. This is a show that's going to have interviews with people, RPG people. Now, I assume RPG people will be as easy to get a hold of as board game people are. So I assume that won't be an issue. And,
Maybe.
You know, this is... This show will have the element of an ingenue being led through a world by a grizzled old veteran of it. So there will be very much me asking Georgios to clarify certain aspects. Maybe Georgios focusing on a game for an episode and explaining kind of how it's evolved from edition to edition and what works, what doesn't, why it's good. And so we want this to be... I want to be you, essentially. I want to be the listener. The inexperienced young buck who goes to the sensei and gets taught how to use my katana.
Wax on, wax off, I believe is the term.
Alright, so that was it. That's our first RPG show, and I just wanted to say that this show was made possible because you backed us on Patreon. If you want more things like this, if you want us to expand and go into different areas, it's your contributions that enable us to do this. So as well as a thank you, I'd just like to say, if you like this and you value it, tell your friends. Mm-hmm. Get them to give us their monies.
Yes, don't give us your money. You probably don't have enough. Find very, very wealthy friends and tell them to give us their money.
Alright, anyway, Georgios, so you come out of the tavern and you're confronted by 4 nubile gronk-gadonks. They pull out their swords. They swing at your beautifully coiffured armour. What do you do?
I shoot them with my bow.